Hey y'all, welcome to the Team LoCoFit Roundtable, hosted by me, Laurin Conlon, owner of Team LoCoFit. Each week, I am joined by one of our coaches to dive headfirst into the nutrition, training, mindset, and coaching strategies we use with our clients. If you loved the show, please subscribe, leave us a review, tell a friend, you know the drill. And for more information about coaching, the programs we offer, and additional content, visit teamlocofit.com. All right, we are back with Rick, our mental health consultant. And if you guys didn't check out the last two that we did together, it was kind of an anxiety part 1 and part 2. The first one was about, what is anxiety? And then the second one was more treatment. So we wanted to do a follow-up on depression because anxiety and depression are pretty much the most common mental health kind of disorders you would see, right?
Yes.
And so super relevant, and they can be intertwined, which we'll definitely talk about. But this one will be on just the same thing, kind of like what is depression, what are some of the symptoms, how might you feel when you're going through depressive symptoms, what is normal, et cetera, et cetera. So
yeah. All right.
Here we go.
So depression, what is depression? What does it look like? What are the common treatments for it? I think the first thing we want to do is very similar to what we did with the anxiety podcast, is depression is normal, it is expected, especially under given circumstances. And that's a really important point to make, because I think sometimes when a person starts to feel depressed, when they start to feel sad, immediately in their mind they want to take it down this dark hole where something is wrong with them, and they need treatment, and sometimes that's just not really the case. I mean, you're supposed to feel depressed and you're supposed to feel sad with some major life events. When things happen, you lose your job, you separate, you have a breakup, there's a death in the family or some other sickness. Depression is a common response to those situations. It doesn't mean that you suffer from clinical depression. It doesn't even necessarily mean that you need a therapist. It just means to acknowledge what's happening. And depression is a very typical emotional response to those situations. And so becoming familiar with depression and familiar with sadness is an important part in understanding how to move through it, and that this is normal, this is expected, and if it's not unusual, if there's no circumstances that require treatment, give it time and most of it will pass. But it's important to understand that, because I think a lot of times people want to jump the gun. And more importantly, the second, in today's society, there's a lot of people who, like, the second they start to feel any level of emotional discomfort, they're looking for escapes and ways to avoid it. And so they're searching for, medical marijuana, they're searching for antidepressants, they're looking for attention, whatever it is.
Or even a diagnosis, right?
Yeah.
Hey, I want to label my feelings as something where it's no, this is
life.
Normal. Yeah.
This is life. You don't need a definition for it. You don't need a diagnosis. You're absolutely right. They're looking for that label. Mm-hmm. So
it happens a lot of times too with, not only just mental health, but even physical health, right? Anytime that you're feeling something that's out of the ordinary, you want to know immediately, oh my gosh, is this a problem? Do I have a slow thyroid? Is it this? Do I have digestive issues? Oh my gosh, is it SIBO? Right? People they catastrophize things and they go down to the worst possible thing. It's no, maybe you just had a stressful week and you didn't eat something that settled in your stomach. Doesn't mean that you have all these issues. It just means that we should document it and move forward. And if after several weeks it's still there, then we can probably look at it.
Exactly. And you hit it right on the head when you said catastrophize. And we're going to actually get into that later. It is. But I think the underlying theme of this is depression is common and it is a typical response. It's normal. It's allowed. And more importantly, you have permission to be sad, especially when bad things happen, and they're going to. So I think I really wanted to start on that note and say, look, this is normal. It's typical. Understand that part of it. It doesn't mean you have a disorder, but it just means, hey, something in my life has changed, probably dramatically, and it's best if we start to address that. So I think the next natural step here is, what does depression look like? And how does it manifest itself? And if we turn to the DSM or some clinical definitions, I think what you'll see is deep feelings of sadness, feelings of emptiness and irritability, mood swings. You'll have cognitive changes that really impact a person's ability to function. So we'll see a depressed mood, sadness, or deep depression. We'll see a diminished pleasure in participating in activities that they normally found enjoyable. Significant weight loss or weight gain. We'll see insomnia or hypersomnia. For those of you that are unfamiliar with that, insomnia is obviously A disorder where you struggle going to sleep. Hypersomnia is more common, which refers to like excessive sleepiness during the daytime. So it's kind of the opposite, and either one could be can manifest in a particular person. Psychomotor agitation, which has 1,000 different ways to present itself inside of a person. Fatigue, loss of concentration, recurring thoughts of death. These are all like clinical things that people would look for, symptoms in a person who's clinically depressed. And again, for the purposes of this podcast, I definitely want to stay away from depressive disorders and focus on just that general kind of concept of what depression is. And I think if you run down that list, a lot of it is very vague. And I think
it could be a lot of things.
It can be a lot of things. And I think sometimes part of the issue is people look to put themselves into a category, or they'll look to rationalize themselves out of that category. And so it is rather subjective. There's no, two people can look at the same patient and see different things.
It's like when you WebMD a symptom and you're like, oh,
yes,
brain tumor, and you're like, no, you just had a cold, but
right.
Again, catastrophizing, right?
Well, like flu-like symptoms, like pick out how many medical diagnoses have flu-like symptoms as some of the presenting symptoms, and it's like you could have everything from the common flu to HIV.
And that really speaks to how much overlap there really is, right? Like if you look at that list, there's obviously some things that are very distinct from anxiety, but some of them kind of overlap, right? And not totally, and that one thing I feel like I always hear, which I kind of wanted to ask your opinion on this, people always say, oh, anxiety is people who are thinking about the future, and then depression is people who are like always worried about the past. Do you feel like that's like pop culture psychology? Is that like a good way of describing it, or is that kind of like a shitty, right? Like I feel like that's a very common thing that people say, like, oh, if you're anxious, you're always just worried about future you, and then if you're depressed, like you're always just thinking about like the past you.
I say it's fine. I guess if people want to look at it that way, because to me, none of that is really addressing what's really going on. So if that helps you conceptualize it, and as a person who feels better by calling themselves anxious instead of depressed, okay. I don't really care. Yeah, I mean, typically anxiety is more future focused. You're not anxious about things that have already happened. However, depression is not always about things that are happening in the past. I can be depressed about the fact that my grandmother's in the hospital dying, right? She hasn't died yet. That's coming, but I'm still sad about that. I'm sad that I lost my job and I don't have the money to provide for my kids. And all of that is happening right here, right now. That didn't happen in the past. Do people get sad about things that happened? Yes. My grandmother passed away years and years ago, but every time during Christmas, there's always a part of me that gets a little sad when I think about her. So yeah, that's me being sad about something that happened in the past, but it's not accurate.
Yeah, I feel like you always hear that and I'm like,
But it's one of those things, you're splitting hairs sometimes with people.
Yeah.
And so it's just like, okay, do you, but sure, yeah, it's fine. And let it roll off and just kind of keep moving.
That one, I don't remember the medication it was for, but that was like the best tagline ever. They're like, depression hurts. And it was, right, like it was like this, it's like a lady trying to get out of bed and she just like doesn't feel good. And obviously that part of the medication was like depression isn't just a mental thing, it's also like a physical side effect too. And for whatever reason, that probably came out like 10-15 years ago, and like I always remember like depression hurts, and it was like such a good tagline. I'm like, man, whoever came up with that, like genius marketing, because I've never forgotten it. Like I have no idea what the medication is for, but I do know that depression hurts, and that is that is a thing. Like there are going to be physical side effects, which we can definitely go into. As far as like client relationships that we've seen, that is something we have to deal with.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, depression does hurt, and
you're like, I made the commercial,
right? Okay. So depression hurts, and I think one thing that we're going to talk about too, and we're going to get into something first, and then we'll kind of lead into this, is depression doesn't just affect the person who's depressed. It affects everyone around them. And that's super important, I think, in particular for this podcast, as well as even for the anxiety podcast. If I didn't stress that point enough, I really want to make sure that I stress it in this one, and it is, there's people who are listening to this who are like, hey, my mom, my dad, my brother, my sister, my wife, husband suffers from depression. It might not be me, but it's them. And so I do want to address that. It's the same thing with anxiety. And what I like about doing the anxiety podcast and the depression podcast is that they are very interchangeable. Most times when you're talking to somebody, you're hearing them use the words like interchangeably, like anxiety, depression, like they go hand in hand. Very often we don't have one without the other. and they manifest very similarly in some ways. And so depression and anxiety is like, it's just one kind of concept now that I think a lot of clinicians are starting to move toward, especially in today's climate. Like 2020 is the year for depression and anxiety. There's no way around it.
Yeah.
So as a therapist, how do I determine whether or not a person is suffering from depression or not? And this isn't about necessarily diagnosing somebody, but this is some of the tools that I use to kind of help my clients. And so one of the first questions I ask myself is, are you depressed or do you just have a terrible life?
Gotta clap it up for Rick. That is some quality therapy.
So there's a difference between being depressed and just having a bad life.
Yeah.
So let me break this down to being a little bit more empathetic and clinical. So there's events that happen throughout our life. And so it's kind of like there is natural life negativity, things that are going to happen naturally throughout the course of any person's life that are going to be bad. And then there is self-imposed negativity or self-imposed depression or misery, for lack of a better term. So what's the difference between these two things? Well, a natural negative life event is having a low-paying job, or your money is tight so you can't afford to do anything beyond what your budget allows, living paycheck to paycheck. Your wife or husband gets sick, somebody in your family dies. Like, these are things that every single person throughout their life encounters, unless you're truly fortunate. But even if you have all the money in the world, there's still other things, natural life events. People die, people get sick, career changes happen or don't happen. We fail at something we're trying to do. These are natural negative life events. And so I think the important concept that I'm trying to teach people is there's a difference if we look at it in terms of like a scale of, if I'm at 0, meaning my life is just moving along and everything is great, and a natural negative life event occurs, it's going to bring about feelings of depression, and it's going to stress my family, it's going to stress me out. I make that worse when I impose my own misery onto that. And so there's a difference between, it's kind of like you're your own worst enemy sometimes. So let me give you an example of like a self-imposed negative factor, okay, that leads into and creates these feelings of being overwhelmed. So natural life event, grandma's, I don't want to use grandma. Okay, so you're living paycheck to paycheck. That was one of the ones I used earlier. That's a natural negative life. Like, I just don't have maybe the education or something to promote that. That's negative. So it affects my family. Everybody's kind of feeling stressed and overwhelmed. Well, self-imposed negativity is, now that I'm living paycheck to paycheck, I decide to take one of my paychecks and go to the casino and gamble away the money, right? So I made a situation that was already bad much worse by doing that. Or, grandma's in the hospital, so we'll go back to that. So grandma's in the hospital and she's dying, and this is really sad. So instead of being at the hospital, I go out to the bar and go get wasted and drink, right? So I'm taking a negative life event and I'm adding to it. And there is a difference between tragedy and somebody creating misery in their life. And I think people lose that part of it. And it's like, your life isn't, you're not a depressed person. There's just negative things that have happened in your life. And this is normal and it's typical to go back to the beginning. But are you making things worse? You're creating more problems for yourself. And that's an important thing, is like, how did I make this? This is more self-imposed. This is me bringing this on. I made something that was originally 6 or 7 in terms of a scale of pain, and now I'm making it a 10 because I'm making it worse. So I think sometimes it's helping people understand those patterns that exist and how are you making this situation worse. And I'm sure you've seen your own clients do this when it comes to health and fitness,
Oh yeah, and that would be going back to, I don't know what you would term it, but the self-sabotage type of behavior, right? So you're making something, like you said, it's already bad, much worse. So a really common food example for clients is if they've eaten something that, let's say they deem that off plan, whether it actually is off plan or they deem it off plan, then, the logical thing would be like, oh, hey, I went out to eat, like maybe I ate too much, maybe I had a few drinks, like I'm just gonna go to bed, and start tomorrow. Like that's like a healthy response. But instead they go home and they continue to eat, and then they raid their pantry, and then they feel worse about themselves the next day, and then potentially the next day they fast for most of the day, and then they end up overeating later, right? Like it becomes this like cycle. And that's super, super common, is either overdoing it or underdoing, or kind of a combination of both. Or, you know, like, hey, you know, maybe I did eat off plan, right? And instead of just handling it with like a healthy response, okay, tomorrow I'm going to go do 2 hours of cardio, and then I'm going to go in the sauna, and then I like going to repeat these like negative, like I hate myself thoughts, and like all of that just kind of gets out of control really, really fast. And if somebody doesn't have a good response or a good like accountability group or like a coach or anything like that, then it just kind of continues. And that's where you like look up in a few months and you're like, wow, like I don't have a good handle on my relationship with food or myself or exercise.
Yes, exactly. And
that will make them depressed.
Yeah. And so it is, it's one hand feeds the other, and it's a cycle that continues to create. And so I think sometimes it's really important for me to break down for my clients sometimes, and for me to better conceptualize whether this is a person who's really struggling with depression or this is a person who just has problems. Because I would make the argument that losing your job causes stress on the family, which can cause stress on your relationships and isolation from your friends, and decreases your energy and your motivation, you know, to find a new job or something like that. That is a problem, not necessarily depression. And that's an important distinction, because problems don't always equal depression. Depression isn't always in your head. It's not necessarily the result of a chemical imbalance, which we can talk about that a little bit if you want. Which to me, most people don't have a chemical imbalance. Like 90% of the people walking around on antidepressants don't have chemical imbalances. And people love that as a safe way. You know, half the people who will tell you that, not even half, way more than half, have never had brain scans and have never had neuroimaging done to determine where their serotonin levels are. And they're just using that because it's something they heard in the media, and it sticks and it works. And so, hey, this justifies my need for an antidepressant.
Pop culture psychology.
It is.
I heard that somewhere and I was like, oh my gosh, this is like the best title for like all this terrible advice that like keeps circulating the world. Like, you should just feel happy all the time. Like, motherfucker, no you shouldn't. That's not accurate. This is why I'm not a psychologist. In case you guys are wondering.
Yeah, no, I agree with all that. But yeah, so depression isn't always in your head. It's a byproduct. It's a result of problems. And I think it's an important thing for me as a clinician, and when I'm trying to separate between, is the person clinically depressed, what are their problems, and how do I address them? You know, if it's not the depression is the byproduct. It's almost like depression is the symptom rather than the cause of the issues. And so it's like, okay, I don't really need to address the depression. You're telling me you're depressed, that's fine. You kind of sit with that for a minute while I figure out what I feel like, all right, these are the other things that are happening. And so if we can start to address some of these other things, a lot of times we see the depression starts to resolve itself. So that's kind of a really important distinction to make.
Yeah, a lot of times a client will be like, oh, you know, when we ask all our questions in the check-in, right, and I can kind of, especially if I've worked with someone for a while, I can kind of pick up if they've had like an off week, right, like just by the way that they're responding to certain things. And, you know, they might say like, oh, well, I've had like more of like a depressed week, or I've had like some more depressive type symptoms. And if there's somebody who said like, hey, I've been struggling with this for years, okay, that's understandable. But if it's just like out of the blue one week and they're typically fine, it's like, all right, like let's handle these stressors, like let's handle like what's going on. And then that doesn't mean that you need to like run out and seek treatment. It just might mean like we need to handle like the event that's happening, and then it's going to clear up. Obviously, if it's persistent, which we'll definitely talk about, like that's kind of when it changes. You said something about like not having as much enjoyment with things, and like that's actually something that we will see with clients, right? Like they just don't enjoy things as much, right? Like whether it's part of the process or just in general, like going to the gym or just kind of just daily activities, it's kind of just like masked with this layer of like gray, I guess, right? And like that would kind of be a good way of describing it for some people. And that's kind of when it's like, okay, like if this is week to week, that's when it's like, all right, there may be something else going on here. It's not just like, oh, there was one hard week, or like, you know, you lost your job this week. Like, yeah, you're going to be probably pretty depressed and anxious. Like, we got it.
Yeah.
But if this is like a constant, like there's no real changes, but there's always this like layer of grayness like over, it's like, all right, like this might be something we need to address.
Yeah, when you no longer seek joy in the things that used to bring you joy and bring balance into your life, you know, those are good indicators that something is wrong. Again, is it an indicator that you need to run to a therapist? No. And I am a therapist. I definitely want people coming into my office who need help, but not every problem requires therapy, you know. And again, I also want to make this point. The goal of any good therapist should be to eventually get rid of their clients, to teach you to be self-sufficient and autonomous, and that you don't need to, you know, I shouldn't be it should never get to a point where you require your therapist to function. Case in point, it should be the opposite of that. The therapist should be giving you the tools and skills that you need to be self-sustaining and functioning in a world without me, you know. And that's just the reality. Some people like it the other way, and I think sometimes, you know, that's when we start getting into like those codependent kind of relationships and very unhealthy boundaries for the therapist or for the client. So just important things to kind of manage. But just because you no longer are finding joy in something, again, doesn't mean you need to run to a therapist, but it just means, hey, maybe I should stop and pay attention. Something might be wrong. And what else might be causing this? So definitely some stuff. So another kind of, you know, that we had started talking about a little bit earlier is depression doesn't just affect the person that has depression, it affects everyone around them. So there might be some people who are listening to this going like, well, this is great, I don't have depression, but I have a family member who has depression, and so what do I do? And so the worst thing you can do when a family member or somebody you care about who has depression is to try and fix their problems for them. Because what happens is when a person is depressed, right, and you try to help a person who is depressed by giving them advice and creating a plan for them and telling them how they should feel better, and you address whatever problems that person is having, right, and then they don't do that and you don't see anything happening and inevitably they fail, this then leaves you, or me, let's say I'm that person who's trying to help somebody, not as a therapist but as a person. So like I've created strategies for all their problems and I'm really trying to help them, and now that I've watched them fail, despite their best effort, I start to feel helpless because I couldn't change them, right? And then I actually can begin to feel the same level of helplessness that the person who's depressed is feeling. And then that makes me start to get angry because this person's not succeeding, right? And I'm trying, but you're not succeeding and you're not doing anything. And so it creates this like insane cycle for people where you have a person who's depressed who feels helpless and can't do anything. So you create this wonderful plan for them. And then you just get sucked into this cycle where like, hey, this person who is helpless, now I feel helpless for not helping them. And because I feel helpless, I start to feel angry over this. And it can even go beyond that. Like I've had clients where it's like, you know, you start to feel guilty over being angry about a person who is as helpless as they are and depressed as they are. And so it creates this vicious cycle that you never get out of. And it gets really unhealthy and really toxic for everyone who's involved. And so, you know, internally, like you have to take into consideration what that person who is depressed is feeling. And you want to know those things, you want to understand those things, but you also want it to be very clear on where the boundaries are for you to help that person and where you're enabling that person. And that's kind of an important concept, because what happens in family dynamics is you're depressed. So Lauren's depressed. Well, you're feeling weak, you're feeling helpless, you're feeling hopeless, right? And you have low energy. And so what ends up happening is internally, that's how you feel. But what happens is like at the same time, you activate everybody who's around you, who is your natural support network, your husbands, your boyfriends, whomever it is, your friends. They suddenly like activate their like competency and they start trying to help you and they're really good at it. And then they're watching you struggle. So they feel defeated by that. And so what it does is it almost makes people like take a step back. And so it's really weird that this person who is quote unquote helpless and powerless can exert so much power over everyone around them, and it creates a really toxic environment. And so what I see is a lot of the family members of a person who is suffering from depression come to see me. And they're like, my mom is depressed, my dad's depressed, my grandfather, my kids, whatever. And it has created this really sick cycle for them to be in.
Because it's hard because you don't want to just watch that person. You want to feel like you can help them,
yes.
right? Like you, if you don't, then you feel like, oh, well, I'm just contributing to the problem. I could be helping, but then, like you said, that line of enabler versus helper, I don't know if that was the other word that you used, is really really thin. It's a really thin line, and that actually happens with coaching too, right? Like you can enable people's problems, or you can help them, right? Like, so something I would imagine that goes with therapy as well too is like you can tell people what they want to hear, and that will keep them in longer, right? Like that keeps them dependent on you, not you necessarily, but like a therapist.
Yeah.
The same thing happens with coaching, right? Like if I tell people what they want to hear and I don't actually push them to be better and be more self-sufficient, well then what am I doing? And that doesn't mean that you can't work with people for a long time and have a great relationship, but it also means that you're continuing to challenge them and not just like lay over whenever they say like, hey, I want to do this, and you're like, oh, okay, like you know that that's wrong, but you just give in and say, yeah, sure, and you continue to enable those really negative behaviors, and then that person never gets better. Because why would a coach do that, or why would a therapist do that? Because it's easier. It's much easier to just be like, yeah, you know, fine, you keep asking me this, I'll just let you do it.
Yeah, and sometimes it's our own willingness, it's our own eagerness to want to make that person feel better, that it compels us to do those things. It compels us to maybe take the path of least resistance and to do the thing for them, or to tell them what they want to hear. And instead, because it doesn't make them actually feel better, it instead leaves us feeling just as helpless and as hopeless as they do. And it creates that cycle, and that's where it gets really unhealthy. You know, and so hopefully, I know this is something that is creating awareness within people who might be living with somebody who is depressed, enough to be like, okay, what do I need to learn in order to be effective with this person? And how do I manage this within myself if I am that person? Because I do know that there are some people who struggle with depression who are very unaware of the impact that they have on people around them. You know, and when I draw this to their attention, it's heartbreaking for them. They don't realize that everyone around them has been helping, and how they feel, and more importantly, how they've made them feel. Now, we all take responsibility for our own emotions. So yes, no one makes you feel anything. But the reality is, if you have somebody who's really significant in that family who is depressed and isn't aware of how they're impacting their family members, it can be really heartbreaking for them in therapy to realize the effect. You know, and some of the ways we go about doing this is when a family's coming in, you know, we have them write letters and we have them talk about almost like kind of like an intervention. You ever seen intervention where they're like, write the letter and tell them exactly how your behavior has affected them, and like maybe the least judgmental way that you can. And then when the person hears these things and they're like, oh my God, sometimes it can be a great motivator. You have to be really careful that it doesn't backfire and send them spiraling down the hole even more, where they're like, well, this is another reason for me to kill myself, you know? So yeah, there's a balancing act with it, but to be aware of, if you're that person who struggles with depression, I want you to be aware of the fact that the people around you have probably been trying to help you, and it can be exhausting, and it can be a very defeating process for them. So hopefully this kind of paints a decent picture of what depression is and how it can affect people around them and you personally. You know, any other kind of questions as it relates to defining depression?
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, somebody's like, say, you know, the person in the family has depression, right? And like other people are trying to help. The people trying to help don't necessarily know the best way either, right? Like that is where a trained clinician comes in, and they might have the best intentions, but it's not their job to fix it for you.
Correct.
You know what I mean? So that's another thing to like keep in mind, like those people are trying their best, but it might not be solved because that's not necessarily like their skill set.
Right.
So it's just something to consider.
On the next one, when we start getting into treatment, I'll pick up right here and we'll talk about, you know, because I touched on it where I said the difference between helping and enabling, and what you can do as a family member in treating that person who has depression, and how you can help them safely and effectively, and what you should or shouldn't be doing.
Perfect. So thank you guys so much for tuning in as always. If you have any questions, you can send us an email at info@teamlocofit.com. For more information on anything else, go to teamlocofit.com. Again, super simple. And we will catch you guys Wednesday for the next episode.